I held my newborn son in the quiet hospital room while Claire lay in the bed beside me, smiling through tears and exhaustion. And the strange thing about that moment was how peaceful everything felt. The soft beeping of the heart monitor blended with the low hum of hospital lights, and the tiny weight of the baby in my arms made the entire world feel smaller and somehow more important at the same time. His fingers curled around mine like he already knew me, like he had been waiting for this moment just as much as we had. Claire watched us from the bed, her hair messy from hours of labor, her eyes shining with that mixture of happiness and disbelief that new parents always seem to have in those first quiet minutes. "You're holding him like you've done it your whole life," she whispered softly. I laughed under my breath. "I'm trying not to drop him," I said. Claire smiled, the tired kind of smile that comes from surviving something intense and beautiful at the same time. She reached out slowly and brushed her hand across the baby's cheek. "He looks like you," she said. That made something warm settle into my chest, because for the first time in a very long time, the future felt simple. But the strange thing about moments like that is how they make you think about everything that led up to them, how one decision leads to another, and how sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you becomes the doorway to the best thing you never expected. Across town, at that exact moment, two people were probably still trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so completely. My ex-wife and my former best friend. The two people who had spent years betraying me without realizing they were slowly destroying their own lives in the process. Karma is a funny thing. People imagine it like some kind of cosmic punishment that strikes immediately when someone does something wrong. But in reality, it moves slower than that. It waits. It lets people keep digging their own holes until the moment they finally realize there's no way out. And the irony of my situation was that the best revenge I ever got wasn't something I planned. It was something life gave me. Claire squeezed my hand gently. "You're thinking again," she said. I looked up at her. "What makes you say that?" "You do that thing with your eyebrows," she said softly. "The one where you're replaying something in your head." I chuckled. "You're getting too good at reading me." She smiled again and closed her eyes for a moment, resting after everything she had been through that night. I looked down at my son again, and just like that, my mind drifted back to where the whole story started. Back to the first moment when something small felt wrong. Because the truth is, betrayal almost never begins with something obvious. It starts with tiny details. Little things that don't make sense. Moments you brush off because the alternative explanation feels too painful to accept. For me, the first clue wasn't a message. It wasn't a late-night phone call. It wasn't even the security footage I would eventually find. It was something much simpler. A smell. One night almost a year earlier, I came home late from work and my wife was sitting on the couch watching television. Everything looked normal at first. The same living room we had shared for years. The same quiet hum of the air conditioner running through the house. She even smiled when I walked in and asked if I wanted leftovers from dinner. But when I leaned down to kiss her hello, something felt strange. Her perfume. It wasn't the one she always wore. At first I didn't think much of it. People try new perfumes sometimes. But the moment I stepped back, the scent hit me again, and my brain made a connection I couldn't ignore. I knew that smell. Not because my wife had ever worn it before, but because I had bought it once as a birthday gift. Not for her, for Claire. Claire had laughed when she opened the present that year and joked that I must have better taste in perfume than her own husband. It had become a running joke between us during group dinners, the kind of harmless thing friends tease each other about, except now the scent was drifting from my wife's neck. I remember standing there in the living room for a second longer than normal, trying to decide if I was imagining things. My wife noticed the pause. "What?" she asked with a small smile. "Nothing," I said, but something in my chest tightened quietly, because the smell was unmistakable. And the strange thing about instincts is that once they start whispering, they rarely stop. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other small details. My wife texting more often. My best friend stopping by the house more frequently when I was working late. Little glances between them during dinners that lasted half a second too long. None of it was proof, just enough to make my mind restless. Then one night, after a long day at work, I checked something I had never paid attention to before. The security camera outside our house. And what I saw on that footage changed everything. Because the car pulling into my driveway that night wasn't mine. And the man stepping out of it was my best friend. When I first saw my best friend's car pulling into my driveway that night, I honestly believed there had to be some kind of reasonable explanation. Your brain does that automatically when something painful appears in front of you. It starts scrambling for alternate realities where everything still makes sense. Maybe he forgot something at the house earlier that week. Maybe my wife had asked him to drop something off while I was working late. Maybe I was just tired and overthinking things because of the weird perfume moment that had been stuck in my head for days. But the strange thing about evidence is that it doesn't care what you hope is true. The security camera recorded everything with quiet, unemotional clarity. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table when I opened the footage on my laptop. It was nearly midnight, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of a car passing outside. My wife had already gone to bed upstairs. She told me she was exhausted and turned in early, kissing my cheek before disappearing up the stairs. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I sat there replaying the footage over and over again. The timestamp read 8:17 p.m. The camera angle showed the front of the house clearly, the driveway, the porch, and the small patch of lawn near the mailbox where we had planted flowers last spring. Then headlights appeared. A black sedan rolled slowly into the driveway and stopped. Even before the driver stepped out, I already knew whose car it was. Mark, my best friend since college, the guy who had been standing beside me on the day I got married. He stepped out casually and walked toward the front door like someone who had done it 100 times before, which, to be fair, he had. Mark and I had been close for almost 15 years. Our wives were friends. We spent holidays together. Our lives had been woven together in a way that made it impossible to imagine betrayal existing anywhere inside that circle. The camera recorded him knocking once. The door opened almost immediately. My wife stood there. She was smiling. The kind of smile people give someone they're genuinely happy to see. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Friends visit friends all the time. But then something strange happened. She looked both directions down the street before letting him inside. The door closed quickly behind him. I stared at the screen. My brain tried to process what I had just seen. Maybe she was just checking if I was home yet. Maybe... I fast-forwarded the footage. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. 20 minutes. Still nothing. The front door stayed closed. The porch light remained on. 30 minutes. 40. I felt my jaw tighten slightly. Then, almost 2 hours later, the door opened again. Mark stepped outside. His shirt was slightly wrinkled. My wife followed him onto the porch. They stood close together. Too close. For a moment they just looked at each other. Then she reached up and adjusted his collar like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then they kissed. Not a quick, awkward mistake. Not something accidental. A real kiss. Slow. Comfortable. Familiar. I remember leaning back in my chair at that moment and feeling something strange settle into my chest. Not anger yet. Not heartbreak. Just a quiet numbness that spread through me like cold water. Because suddenly the perfume made sense. The late-night texts. The weird glances during dinners. All those small details that had been floating around in my mind like puzzle pieces finally snapped together. But the worst part wasn't the kiss. The worst part came next. After they pulled apart, Mark said something. The camera didn't record sound, but I could read enough of his lips to understand one word. Soon. My wife nodded. Then she leaned forward and kissed him again. Mark walked down the driveway and got into his car. The headlights turned on. The sedan disappeared down the street. I sat there staring at the empty driveway long after the footage ended. Eventually, I closed the laptop. My first instinct was to march upstairs and wake my wife up right then, to drag her down into the kitchen and show her the video, to demand answers. But something stopped me. Not weakness, not fear, something else. Strategy. Because if I confronted them now, all I would get were excuses and lies. But if I stayed quiet, I could learn the truth, the entire truth. And suddenly there was someone else in this situation I couldn't stop thinking about. Claire, Mark's wife, one of the kindest people I knew. The same woman whose perfume my wife had been wearing that night. I leaned back in the kitchen chair and stared at the dark ceiling. Because if Mark and my wife had been doing this behind our backs, there was only one question left. Did Claire know? And if she didn't, what would happen when she found out? After watching the footage that night, I didn't sleep. Not even for a minute. I tried at first. I went upstairs, slid into bed beside my wife, and closed my eyes like everything was normal. She shifted slightly in her sleep and murmured something I couldn't understand, her arm brushing against mine for a second before settling again. The room smelled faintly like that same perfume I had noticed earlier. Claire's perfume. The scent made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain, because now I knew exactly why it was there. I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying the security footage in my mind over and over again. The kiss. The way she checked the street before letting him inside. The word I had read on his lips. Soon. That word bothered me more than anything else. Soon what? Eventually I gave up on sleep and went back downstairs. The laptop was still sitting on the kitchen table exactly where I had left it. I opened it again and pulled up the camera footage, this time scrolling back further through the archive. At first I only checked the last week. Nothing unusual. Then I checked 2 weeks earlier. Still nothing obvious. For a moment I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe that night had been the first time. Maybe this had just started recently. Maybe... Then I clicked a date from 3 weeks earlier. The video loaded instantly, and there it was again. Mark's car pulling into my driveway. I felt my stomach drop slightly. This time the timestamp read 6:42 p.m. I watched the footage carefully. He walked to the door, knocked once. My wife opened it immediately. Same smile, same quick glance down the street before letting him inside. The door closed. I leaned closer to the screen, because now I wasn't just watching the footage. I was studying it. The small details started appearing once I looked closely enough. My wife had changed clothes between when I left for work and when Mark arrived. The porch light had been turned on even though it wasn't fully dark outside yet. It looked like preparation, like someone expecting a visitor. I fast-forwarded again. 1 hour. 2 hours. The door finally opened again at 8:31 p.m. Mark stepped outside. This time they didn't kiss, but the way they stood close together on the porch said enough. Then he left. I sat there staring at the screen, because suddenly the situation looked very different. The night I had seen earlier wasn't a one-time mistake. It was part of a pattern, and the more footage I checked, the worse that pattern became. 3 weeks earlier, 4 weeks earlier, 5 weeks earlier. Every time the same routine appeared. Mark arriving when I was at work, staying for 1 or 2 hours, leaving before I got home. By the time I finished reviewing the recordings, the clock on the wall read almost 3 in the morning, and my hands were shaking slightly, because the number of visits I had counted was no longer something I could ignore. 8. 8 separate times in the past month alone. 8 visits I knew about. And that was only because the camera storage only kept 30 days of footage. For all I knew, this had been happening much longer. I closed the laptop slowly and leaned back in the chair. The kitchen felt very quiet. Outside, the first faint signs of sunrise were starting to lighten the sky. For the first time since discovering everything, anger finally started creeping into my chest. Not the explosive kind, the quiet kind, the kind that makes people patient. Because the more I thought about it, the more one question kept circling in my mind. Claire. She had to know something. Not necessarily about the affair itself, but about Mark, about his schedule, about where he was during those evenings. People rarely hide secrets perfectly. Eventually, someone close to them notices something. And if anyone deserved to know the truth about this situation, it was her. Claire had always been the kind of person people trusted easily. She was warm without being naive, kind without being weak. The kind of woman who remembered small details about people's lives and asked thoughtful questions when they were struggling. The kind of person who didn't deserve this. I thought back to the last time the four of us had dinner together. Claire had been laughing about something Mark said, teasing him about forgetting their anniversary the year before. At the time, it felt like normal married couple humor. Now it made my stomach turn. Because if Mark had been sleeping with my wife while smiling across the table at Claire, that was a different level of betrayal entirely. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen sink. The sky outside was turning pale gray. Somewhere upstairs, my wife shifted in her sleep. And in that quiet moment, one decision became very clear. I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. I needed to understand everything first, and the only way to do that was to get closer to the one person who might unknowingly hold the answers. Claire. The next afternoon, I sent her a message. Nothing suspicious, just something casual. Hey, random question. Do you still have the recipe for that pasta you made last time? I want to try making it. She replied almost immediately. Of course, but fair warning, it's harder than it looks. I smiled slightly. Then I typed the next message. We should grab coffee sometime. I could use cooking advice. Her reply came a minute later. Sure. Tomorrow afternoon? I stared at the screen for a moment, because something about that simple conversation felt strange, not suspicious, just unexpected. Then I noticed something else. Claire added one more message. Actually, that might be perfect timing. I frowned slightly and typed back, perfect timing for what? The typing bubble appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, her message arrived. Because there's something I've been meaning to ask you about your wife. And suddenly my chest felt very tight. The next afternoon I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, mostly because I didn't trust myself not to pace around my house like a nervous teenager if I stayed there any longer. The place was one of those quiet neighborhood spots with soft music and the constant sound of milk steaming behind the counter. Sunlight spilled through the big front windows, and for a moment the normalcy of the room made the entire situation feel surreal. I sat at a small corner table and tried to rehearse what I was going to say. The problem was I had no idea what Claire was going to ask. Her message the night before kept replaying in my head. Because there's something I've been meaning to ask you about your wife. That sentence could mean 100 different things. Maybe she had noticed the same strange behavior I had. Maybe she suspected something between them. Or maybe she just wanted advice about something harmless, and I was projecting my own paranoia onto it. I checked the door every few seconds until she finally walked in. Claire looked exactly the same as she always did. Simple jeans, a light sweater, her hair pulled back loosely. The same quiet warmth in her expression that made people trust her almost immediately. She spotted me and smiled, waving before walking over to the table. Sorry if I'm a few minutes late, she said, setting her bag down. You're not, I replied. I just got here early. That wasn't technically true, but she didn't question it. We ordered coffee and sat down, and for the first few minutes the conversation stayed completely normal. Work, weekend plans, the usual small talk people use to warm up a conversation. Claire had always been easy to talk to. That hadn't changed. But underneath the casual conversation, I could feel something else waiting just below the surface, like a question she hadn't decided how to ask yet. Eventually, she stirred her coffee slowly and looked up at me. Can I ask you something? Kind of weird, she said. My chest tightened slightly. Sure. She hesitated for a second before speaking. Have you noticed your wife acting different lately? There it was. I kept my expression neutral, even though my mind was suddenly racing. Different how? I asked. Claire shrugged slightly. I don't know, just distracted. She looked down at the table for a moment. And Mark has been acting strange too. Hearing his name out loud made my jaw tighten slightly, but I forced a small smile. What do you mean? Claire sighed quietly. He's been coming home later than usual, she said. Working late, supposedly. The irony of that sentence was almost painful. And when he does get home, he's glued to his phone. She looked up again. You know that feeling when something seems off, but you can't prove anything? I nodded slowly. Yeah. She leaned back in her chair. I feel like I'm going crazy sometimes. For a moment, I didn't know what to say, because sitting across from her now, hearing the uncertainty in her voice, made the entire situation feel even worse than it already did. Claire wasn't naive. She wasn't blind. She just didn't have the piece of information that connected everything. The same piece I had discovered 2 nights earlier. The security footage. I considered telling her right then, pulling out my phone, showing her the video, ending the mystery immediately. But something stopped me again. Not hesitation. Timing. Because if I showed her the footage now, the entire situation would explode instantly. Mark would know. My wife would know. And whatever they were planning, the thing Mark had said would happen soon, would disappear before I understood it. Claire was still watching me carefully. You've noticed it too, haven't you? She asked quietly. I took a slow breath. I've noticed a few things, I admitted. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank God, she said softly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she added something that made my stomach twist. There's one other thing that's been bothering me. I looked at her. What? Claire hesitated again. Then she said something I didn't expect. Last week I found a receipt in Mark's jacket pocket. My pulse quickened slightly. What kind of receipt? Claire looked uncomfortable. A hotel receipt. The words landed like a weight on the table between us. But the date didn't make sense, she continued. He told me he was working late that night. I stayed very still, because suddenly the pieces in my mind started moving faster. Hotel. Working late. Claire sighed again and rubbed her forehead. I tried to convince myself it was something innocent, she said, but the location of the hotel was downtown. She looked up at me again. And the strange thing is, that's the same night your wife told everyone you were out of town for work. My chest tightened, because that was the exact night I had checked the security footage. The same night Mark had been at my house. Claire was watching my reaction closely now. Do you think we're both imagining things? She asked quietly. I didn't answer immediately, because suddenly another memory surfaced. Something small I had ignored earlier. The word I saw on Mark's lips in the security footage. Soon. Claire stirred her coffee again, clearly nervous now. Then she looked up and said something that made the situation even worse. There's something else I haven't told anyone yet. My chest tightened. What? Claire lowered her voice slightly. 2 nights ago, she said. Mark left his laptop open in the living room. She paused, and a folder popped up on the screen. I felt my pulse quicken again. What kind of folder? Claire looked directly into my eyes. The folder was labeled with your wife's name. Then she added the one sentence that made the room suddenly feel very small. And inside were pictures I don't think I was supposed to see. For a moment after Claire said the words, neither of us moved. The cafe was still filled with the quiet noise of normal life. Coffee grinders humming behind the counter, spoons tapping against porcelain cups, people laughing softly at nearby tables. But the world around our little corner suddenly felt distant, like someone had turned the volume down on everything except the 2 of us. A folder? I asked carefully. Claire nodded slowly. Yes. She looked down at her coffee again, stirring it even though the spoon had stopped making any sound. I wasn't trying to snoop, she said quickly. I swear I wasn't. I just walked past the laptop and the screen lit up. I believed her. Claire wasn't the type of person who went digging through someone's private things without a reason. But the folder name caught my eye, she continued quietly. Your wife's name. My chest tightened slightly. What was inside it? Claire hesitated. Then she looked back up at me. Pictures. I felt my jaw clench. What kind of pictures? Her voice dropped even lower. The kind people don't keep unless they're hiding something. For a moment I didn't say anything, because hearing it from her mouth made the situation feel even more real than watching the security footage alone at night. Claire took a slow breath. I didn't open most of them, she said. Just the first few. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. They were together. I nodded slowly. My mind was already replaying the footage I had watched earlier that week. The porch, the kiss, the way my wife had smiled when she opened the door. Claire looked like she was bracing herself for my reaction. Did you know? She asked quietly. That question hung between us for several seconds. Part of me wanted to lie, to pretend this was the first time I was hearing about any of it, but something about Claire's expression made that impossible. So I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Her eyes followed the movement immediately. I found something too, I said. What? She asked. Instead of answering, I opened the security footage and slid the phone across the table. Claire stared at the screen as the video started playing. Mark's car pulling into the driveway. The knock on the door. My wife opening it. The smile. Claire didn't move. She watched the entire video without saying a word. When the kiss happened at the end, her shoulders dropped slightly, like something she had been holding up inside herself finally collapsed. I stopped the video and looked up at her. She was very quiet. I'm sorry, I said softly. Claire blinked a few times like she was trying to process everything all at once. How long have you known? She asked. A few days. She nodded slowly. Then she leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. I think I knew too, she admitted quietly. Before the laptop. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? Claire gave a sad half smile. You know how sometimes your brain figures something out before you're ready to admit it? I nodded. She looked down at the table again. Mark has been distant for months. Always texting. Always working late. She made air quotes around the last words. And then there was the perfume. My heart skipped slightly. The perfume? I asked. Claire nodded. I noticed it on him once, she said. The same one I wear. For a second, neither of us spoke, because that tiny detail connected something in a way that made the situation feel even stranger. My wife wearing Claire's perfume. Mark smelling like it too. Like some twisted inside joke they both shared. Claire looked up again. You know the worst part? She asked. What? She shook her head slowly. They didn't even try very hard to hide it. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my temples. Yeah, I said quietly. Another long silence settled between us, but this one felt different, less tense, more honest, because now we were both sitting there with the same truth in front of us. Claire finally spoke again. What are you going to do? She asked. I thought about that for a moment. I'm not sure yet. She nodded slowly. Me neither. The strange thing was that despite everything we had just discovered, the conversation didn't feel angry. It felt calm, like two people sitting in the quiet aftermath of a storm that had already passed. Claire reached for her bag. Then she paused. There's one more thing I didn't tell you yet, she said. My chest tightened slightly. What? She pulled out her phone and placed it on the table. I didn't just see pictures in that folder, she said. I frowned. What else was there? Claire turned the phone toward me. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. There were receipts. I looked at the screen. Hotel reservations, travel bookings, dates. My stomach dropped, because the earliest receipt on the screen, was dated almost 3 years earlier. Claire looked at me quietly, and then she said the sentence that made the betrayal suddenly feel much worse than I had imagined. "I think this has been going on longer than our marriages." Claire's hands were shaking slightly when she finished telling me about the folder on Mark's laptop, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The cafe around us continued its quiet rhythm, cups clinking, low music playing through the speakers, people chatting casually at nearby tables. But the world inside that small corner felt completely different now. Claire looked down at her coffee like she was trying to decide whether she should keep talking. "I didn't mean to snoop," she said quietly. I shook my head. "You don't have to explain." She exhaled slowly, then continued. "The laptop was open on the living room table," she said. "Mark had stepped outside to take a phone call, and when I walked past the screen, a folder popped up." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "At first I thought it was work stuff," she added, "but the name on the folder caught my attention." I already knew what name she was about to say. "Your wife's name," Claire said softly. Hearing it again out loud made my stomach tighten. "What was inside?" I asked. Claire hesitated before answering. "Pictures." My chest felt suddenly heavy. "What kind of pictures?" Claire swallowed. "The kind people don't usually keep on their computer unless they're involved." The words hung between us. She rubbed her forehead again. "There were selfies of them together," she said quietly. "Some taken in places I recognized." I didn't interrupt, because part of me already knew where this was going. Claire looked up again. "One of the photos was from a beach trip last year," she said. My mind flashed instantly to the memory. The four of us had taken that trip together. Mark and Claire had rented a small house near the water, and we had spent a long weekend there grilling food, swimming, and joking about how none of us ever took real vacations anymore. Claire continued. "They were standing together on the balcony of the rental house," she said, "but the photo was taken late at night." Her voice dropped slightly. "Everyone else was supposed to be asleep." I felt my jaw tighten, because that meant something very specific. The affair hadn't just been happening behind our backs. It had been happening while we were all in the same house. Claire was watching me carefully now. "I didn't know what to think at first," she said. "I kept telling myself there must be some explanation." Her laugh was small and bitter. But the more photos I opened, the harder that was to believe. I stayed quiet, because Claire needed to finish saying this on her own. "There were hotel pictures," she continued. "Dinner pictures, selfies in his car." She shook her head slowly. "And the timestamps on some of them were from 2 years ago." That sentence landed like a punch. 2 years. The affair hadn't started recently. It had been happening for years. Suddenly, Mark's word from the security footage came back to me again. "Soon." Claire leaned back in her chair. "I closed the folder before he came back inside," she said. "Did he notice?" I asked. She shook her head. "No." For a moment, she stared down at the table again. Then she said something that made my chest tighten even more. "I almost confronted him that night." "What stopped you?" Claire shrugged slightly. "I wasn't ready." Her eyes lifted to mine again. "And honestly, part of me hoped I was wrong." The honesty in her voice made something inside me soften. Claire wasn't angry yet. She was hurt, confused, trying to understand something that hadn't fully revealed itself to her yet. And sitting there across from her, I realized something else. Claire had discovered the truth on her own. I hadn't told her. I hadn't manipulated anything. Life had simply placed us both in the same situation at the same time. Two people slowly realizing the same betrayal from opposite sides. She stirred her coffee again. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." Claire hesitated before speaking. "When you said earlier that you noticed a few things," her voice trailed off slightly, "what exactly did you mean?" The question hung in the air between us, because now we were standing at a crossroads. I could lie, pretend I didn't know anything more than she did, or I could tell her the truth, the full truth, about the security footage, about the visits to my house, about the kiss on the porch. I took a slow breath. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Claire watched me carefully. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I think," I said quietly, "you deserve to see something." I opened the security footage and placed the phone on the table between us. The video started playing. Claire leaned forward slowly. At first, she didn't react. Then Mark appeared on the screen. Her husband walking up my driveway. Her face went pale. The door opened. My wife stood there smiling. Claire covered her mouth with her hand. Then the footage reached the moment on the porch. The kiss. Claire stopped breathing for a second. The video ended. Silence settled between us again. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. Instead, she sat there staring at the blank phone screen for a long time. Finally, she whispered something that made my chest tighten again. "How long?" I answered honestly. "At least a month that I know about." Claire nodded slowly. Then she looked back up at me. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "There's something else you should know." My stomach tightened slightly. "What?" Claire leaned forward and lowered her voice. The pictures on his laptop weren't just normal photos. I felt a chill run through my chest. "What do you mean?" Claire swallowed. Then she said the one sentence I wasn't ready to hear. There were screenshots of messages between them. I stayed still. "What kind of messages?" Claire looked directly into my eyes. "The kind where they talk about what they're planning to do next." My pulse quickened. Planning what? Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly reached into her bag and pulled something out. Her phone. She unlocked it and slid it across the table. "I took pictures of the screen before I closed the laptop," she said. My chest tightened. "What did they say?" Claire looked at me carefully. Then she whispered the sentence that made everything suddenly much worse. "They're not just having an affair." She paused. "They're planning something." Claire's phone sat on the table between us, the screen still glowing softly, and for several seconds neither of us touched it. I could hear the quiet noise of the cafe around us again now, cups clinking, chairs scraping lightly across the floor. But the conversation we had just stepped into felt like something much heavier than the room we were sitting in. "You took pictures of the messages?" I asked quietly. Claire nodded. "I didn't know what else to do," she said. "It felt important." Her voice carried that same calm strength I had always admired about her, even though I could see the pain sitting just behind it. "Go ahead," she added softly. "Look." I picked up the phone slowly. The first image was a screenshot of Mark's laptop screen. A messaging app was open, and the conversation thread clearly showed my wife's name. The timestamps went back months. I scrolled down slightly. The messages were casual at first. Jokes, flirting, plans for meeting up. But the further down I looked, the more serious the conversation became. One message from my wife read, "We can't keep sneaking around forever." Mark's reply came a few seconds later. "We won't have to." I felt my jaw tighten. Another message appeared further down the thread. "Soon, everything changes." The same word. Soon. I kept scrolling. Claire watched me carefully from across the table. "What do they mean by that?" I asked quietly. She shook her head. "I don't know." Another message appeared on the screen. This one from Mark. "Once it happens, we can finally stop pretending." My chest felt tight. Pretending. Pretending what? I continued scrolling until the next part of the conversation appeared. My wife had sent a longer message. "Are you sure this will work?" Mark responded almost immediately. "Of course it will. He trusts me. And Claire trusts you." The sentence made something cold settle into my chest, because suddenly the betrayal felt even deeper than before. They weren't just cheating. They were using us. Claire leaned forward slightly. "There's one message you haven't seen yet," she said. I looked up. "What do you mean?" She tapped the screen gently and slid the next image into view. My stomach dropped as I read it. It was from Mark. Once the trip happens, everything will fall into place. I frowned. What trip? Claire shook her head. I don't know. I stared at the screen again. The date of that message was from 2 weeks earlier. Trip. My mind started scanning through recent plans, vacations, work trips, family gatherings. Then something clicked. Next month, the 4 of us were supposed to take a weekend trip together, a small cabin near the lake. It had been Claire's idea originally, a quiet getaway for all of us. I slowly looked up from the phone. I think I know what they're talking about, I said. Claire frowned slightly. What? The lake trip next month. Her eyes widened slightly. You think they're planning something there? I nodded slowly. They said everything changes after that trip. Claire leaned back in her chair, processing the thought. That's disturbing. Yeah. For a moment we both sat there quietly again. Then Claire said something unexpected. Can I ask you something honest? Of course. She studied my face carefully. When you first messaged me yesterday, was it because you suspected something? The question hit harder than I expected, because technically the answer was yes. I had reached out to Claire partly because I wanted information, partly because I thought she might unknowingly confirm my suspicions. And now, sitting across from her after everything we had just discovered together, that truth felt heavier than it had the night before. I hesitated. Claire noticed immediately. You can tell me, she said gently. I took a slow breath. I did suspect something. She nodded slowly. But you didn't know for sure. No. Claire looked down at the table again. I'm glad you told me, she said quietly. The moment felt strangely honest. 2 people sitting in the middle of a situation neither of us asked for. 2 people slowly realizing how deeply the betrayal went. Then Claire looked back up at me. Do you want to know the worst part? She asked. What? Her voice softened. The messages didn't just talk about the trip. My chest tightened again. What else? Claire reached for her phone and pulled up one more screenshot. This one. I looked down at the screen, and my stomach dropped, because the message from Mark read, Don't worry about him. Once everything happens, we'll finally be together for real. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Together for real. That meant one thing. They weren't planning to end the affair. They were planning to leave us. Claire watched my reaction carefully. Then she said something that made my chest tighten even more. There's something else I didn't tell you yet. I looked up. What? Claire hesitated. Then she spoke the sentence that made the entire situation suddenly feel even bigger than before. The messages mentioned a DNA test. When Claire said the words DNA test, the air between us changed instantly. It was one of those moments where a single phrase opens a door in your mind that you didn't even realize was there, and suddenly 100 terrifying possibilities rush through it all at once. I stared at her across the table. A DNA test? I repeated slowly. Claire nodded. It was mentioned in one of the messages. My chest felt tight. What exactly did it say? Claire unlocked her phone again and scrolled through the screenshots until she found the one she meant. She turned the screen toward me. I leaned forward and read the message. It was from Mark. I already ordered the DNA test. Once we know for sure, everything else will be easier. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. What does that mean? I asked quietly. Claire shook her head. I wish I knew. My mind was already spinning through the possibilities. DNA tests don't usually appear in casual conversations unless someone is questioning something serious. Paternity, family, bloodlines, something big. Claire studied my expression carefully. You're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you? She asked softly. I exhaled slowly. Maybe. The idea forming in my head felt almost too awful to say out loud, but Claire already understood. You think one of the kids might not belong to the person who thinks they're the father, she said quietly. The words sat heavily between us. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, that thought had already crossed my mind the moment I read the message. Claire leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "This is insane," she whispered. "Yeah." Another long silence passed. Then Claire said something else that made my stomach tighten. "The message was sent 3 months ago." I frowned. 3 months? She nodded. "That means the test probably already happened." My chest felt like someone had tied a knot in it. If Mark had ordered a DNA test months ago, that meant he had been suspicious about something long before Claire and I started piecing together the affair, which raised a terrifying possibility. What if the test wasn't about Claire's kids? What if it was about mine? I swallowed slowly. Claire noticed the change in my expression immediately. "What is it?" she asked. I hesitated before answering. "Nothing. Just thinking." But the truth was that a new kind of fear had quietly slipped into the room, because until that moment, the betrayal had been painful but straightforward. An affair. 2 people sneaking around behind our backs. Now the situation felt much bigger, and much more complicated. Claire was still watching me carefully. "You should probably check," she said gently. "Check what?" "The test." I frowned. "What test?" "If Mark ordered one," she said, "there might be records somewhere." The idea made my stomach twist, because suddenly I realized something. Mark and I shared more than just a friendship. We shared business accounts, office spaces, mail deliveries, and sometimes paperwork. If Mark had ordered a DNA test through one of the services our office used for medical screenings and health records, there was a chance the information had passed through our shared administrative system. Claire noticed the look on my face. "You're thinking of something," she said. "Maybe." She leaned forward slightly. "What?" I rubbed the back of my neck. "There's a system at the office," I said slowly. "Some health documentation gets stored there for insurance purposes." Claire's eyes widened slightly. "You think the results might be there?" "I don't know." But the thought had already taken root, because if a test existed, the answer might already be sitting somewhere in a digital file. Claire watched me carefully for several seconds. Then she said something quiet, but surprisingly steady. "If it were me, I'd want to know." Her honesty hit harder than I expected, because she was right. Living with that kind of question hanging over your head would slowly destroy you. I looked down at the phone screen again. The message still glowed there. "I already ordered the DNA test." My chest tightened again. Claire reached across the table and gently turned the phone face down. "You don't have to figure everything out today," she said softly. I nodded. But the truth was that once the idea had entered my mind, it wasn't going anywhere. Not until I had an answer. Claire gathered her things slowly. "I should probably go," she said. I stood up with her. The moment felt strangely different from when we first sat down. Not just 2 people sharing suspicions anymore. Now we were both standing in the middle of something much bigger. Before leaving, Claire paused. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I'm glad we talked." I nodded. "Me too." She started toward the door. Then she stopped and turned back. "Oh," she said, "there's one more thing I forgot to mention." My stomach tightened again. "What?" Claire hesitated. Then she said something that made the entire situation suddenly feel even heavier. The messages didn't say whose DNA test it was. And suddenly the question in my mind felt impossible to ignore. For 3 days after my conversation with Claire, the words DNA test followed me everywhere. At work, at home, even in the quiet moments when I tried to distract myself with normal routines. Every time I looked at my wife across the dinner table, the thought crept back into my mind again. What if the test was about my child? It was a terrifying possibility. not just because of the betrayal it would confirm, but because of what it would mean for everything else in my life. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. The message Claire showed me never said whose DNA test it was. It could have been about something completely unrelated. But the problem with doubt is that once it enters your mind, it refuses to leave until you face it directly. So on the third morning, I went into the office early. The building was quiet at that hour. Only the cleaning staff moved through the hallways while the lights flickered on above the desks. I sat down at my computer and opened the internal system we used for employee insurance records. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, because part of me didn't actually want to find anything. Sometimes ignorance feels safer. But eventually, I typed Mark's name into the search field. A list of documents appeared: health forms, insurance updates, routine paperwork. Then one file caught my attention: genetic test authorization. My chest tightened. I clicked it. The document opened slowly. Most of the page was standard medical language about consent forms and laboratory procedures. But halfway down the page was the detail that made my pulse quicken. Test requested, paternity confirmation. I felt my stomach drop. I kept reading. The document listed the date of the request: 3 months ago. Exactly the same timeline Claire had mentioned. I scrolled further down the page. The next line showed the lab processing number, but there was no result attached, which meant the final report was stored somewhere else. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my temples. At that moment, one thought became painfully clear. If Mark ordered a paternity test 3 months ago, he had been questioning something long before Claire or I discovered the affair, which meant there was only one question left. Who was the test about? My hands moved almost automatically back to the search bar. This time I typed my own name. Several documents appeared immediately: insurance claims, routine medical records. Then another file appeared near the bottom: DNA comparison report. My chest tightened again, because the document date was from the same week Mark had submitted his request. I clicked it. The page opened. The report was short. Just a few lines of technical information followed by a single conclusion. My eyes moved slowly across the screen. And then I finally saw the sentence that mattered. Probability of paternity: 99.99%. For a moment I just stared at the words. The air slowly left my lungs. The child was mine. Completely. There had never been any question. Mark's test hadn't been about me, which meant there was only one possibility left. He had been testing something connected to his own family. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling for several seconds, letting the tension drain out of my chest. The worst fear had been erased, but the situation was still far from over. Because if Mark had been questioning the paternity of one of his own children, that meant the cracks in his marriage had started long before this affair, which also meant something else. Mark had already been suspicious of Claire, and that realization changed the entire picture. Later that evening, I met Claire again at a quiet park near her house. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the grass as we sat on a wooden bench. "Well?" she asked gently. I looked at her. The test wasn't about my child. Claire exhaled slowly. "That's good. But it does mean something else," I added. She frowned slightly. "What?" I explained what I had found in the office system. Claire listened carefully. Then her eyes widened slightly. "You think he was testing one of our kids?" "I don't know." Claire shook her head slowly. "That doesn't make sense." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." For a moment we both sat there quietly again. Then Claire said something unexpected. "You know something strange?" "What?" "Mark never actually told me the results of any test." My stomach tightened slightly. "What do you mean?" She looked at me carefully. "He told me he canceled it." I frowned. "But the report exists." Claire's eyes slowly widened. "You're serious?" I nodded. That meant Mark had lied to her. About the test, about the results, about everything. Claire looked out across the park, processing the information. Then she said something that made the situation feel even more surreal. You realize something, right? What? If he lied about the test. She turned back toward me. Then he never expected anyone else to see the results. And in that moment, I realized something else too. Because the lake trip Mark had been talking about in those messages was only 2 weeks away. 2 weeks until the moment he believed everything would change. But now Claire and I knew the truth, and neither of us had any intention of pretending anymore. Claire looked at me quietly. What are we going to do? I thought about that question for several seconds. Then I finally answered. I think, I said slowly, we let them believe their plan is still working. Claire frowned slightly. Why? I looked back toward the sunset. Because when the truth comes out, I paused. It should happen at the exact moment they least expect it. And the perfect moment was already approaching. The lake trip. The one Mark thought would change everything. But what he didn't know yet was that someone else had already made a decision that would completely destroy his plan. Claire. Because the night before our conversation, she had already told her lawyer everything. The lake trip arrived exactly 2 weeks later, just like Mark had planned. The 4 of us drove up separately that Friday afternoon. The cabin sat near the edge of the water, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked most of the road from view. It was the same place we had visited once before, back when everything still felt simple. The kind of quiet vacation spot couples choose when they want a break from the noise of the city. Mark seemed unusually cheerful when we arrived. Too cheerful. He carried bags inside like he was hosting the weekend, joking about fishing and grilling food later that night. My wife followed him into the kitchen with the same relaxed smile she had been wearing for months. If someone had walked into that cabin without knowing the truth, they would have thought they were watching 4 close friends enjoying a weekend getaway. But the moment felt very different for Claire and me, because we already knew what they believed was going to happen here. Soon, everything changes. That was the phrase Mark had written in the messages. Soon. Dinner was quiet but polite. We talked about work, vacation plans, normal things people say when they are pretending everything is fine. Mark poured drinks. My wife laughed at his jokes. Claire stayed calm beside me, her composure stronger than I expected. If Mark noticed anything strange about her behavior, he didn't show it. After dinner, we sat outside on the deck overlooking the lake. The sun had already disappeared behind the trees, leaving the water dark and still. It should have been peaceful. Instead, the tension between the 4 of us felt almost visible. Eventually, Mark stood up and stretched. Well, he said casually, there's actually something we should talk about tonight. My wife glanced at him. Now? Mark nodded. Yeah. Claire and I exchanged a quick look. The moment had arrived. Mark leaned against the railing like he had rehearsed this speech. I think it's time we all stop pretending, he said. The word pretending echoed in my mind. My wife stood beside him now. She looked nervous but determined. I was going to tell you after the trip, she said softly. But it doesn't make sense to wait anymore. Claire remained completely still. Mark continued speaking. We didn't plan for things to happen this way, he said, but sometimes life shows you what you really want. The irony of that sentence almost made me laugh. My wife looked at me then. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That was the first honest thing she had said in months. Then Mark finished the sentence both of them had clearly practiced. We're going to be together. Silence filled the deck. For a moment, neither Claire nor I moved. Mark watched us carefully, probably expecting anger, shock, something dramatic. Instead, Claire calmly stood up from her chair. Her voice was steady. Good, she said. Mark blinked. What? Claire reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table. Because I was going to tell you something too. Mark frowned slightly. What's that? Claire opened the folder and slid several documents across the table. Security footage screenshots, hotel receipts, copies of the messages. Mark's expression changed instantly. My wife's face turned pale. You went through my computer? Mark said. Claire's voice didn't rise. "You were having an affair with his wife," she replied calmly. "Privacy stopped being your biggest problem." The silence that followed felt heavy. Then Claire added the sentence that ended everything. "I already filed for divorce." Mark stared at her. "What?" Claire didn't hesitate. "My lawyer has the evidence." She gestured to the folder. "And the financial records from those hotel trips." Mark's face went white, because suddenly the situation had shifted completely. The company Mark worked for had strict policies about expense accounts. Those hotel receipts? They weren't personal payments. They were business reimbursements, which meant the affair trips had been paid for with company funds. My wife looked at me then. Her voice was shaking. "You knew?" I nodded slowly. "For a while." Claire stepped closer beside me. "And now everyone else will too," she said quietly. The rest of the weekend collapsed quickly after that. Mark spent most of the night pacing inside the cabin making phone calls. My wife barely spoke. Claire and I sat quietly by the lake long after midnight, the water reflecting the moonlight like glass. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. Some things are understood without words. Months later, the consequences finished unfolding exactly the way they were meant to. Mark lost his job after the company investigation confirmed the expense fraud. The divorce stripped him of most of the assets he had tried to protect. My ex-wife left with nothing but the reality of the choices she had made. And Claire? Claire eventually found something better. Not revenge, not manipulation, something real. Which brings the story back to the hospital room where I was holding my son. The small weight of his body resting peacefully in my arms. Claire looked at me from the bed again and smiled softly. "You're doing that thinking thing again," she said. I chuckled. "Just remembering." "About them?" "Yeah." Claire reached over and squeezed my hand gently. "They made their choices." I looked down at my son again. The strange thing about karma is that people think it arrives like punishment, but sometimes it doesn't come as pain. Sometimes it comes as a second chance. And the truth is, I never made sure Claire carried my child. Life did that on its own. All I did was stop trying to hold on to the life two other people had already destroyed. Because the moment they thought they were stealing my future, they were actually clearing the path for the right one.